All right, guys, here we go. Our document for, period 4. All right, let me start off by saying, as I took a look at this, this is the hardest DBQ I've ever seen in my life, bar none. I'm not saying I couldn't get a 5 on it, but, I would take a beating while doing it. So I'm going to do the best that I can here. I'm not going to read you some prepared remarks here that I have. I'm not going to go through and read my notes as I talk to you guys. I just think it's hard because it's asking a couple of different things. And again, relax, 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 relax. There is no way at all that on May 15th, you are going to open up your computer and see you've got to write a DBQ on the air of good feelings, nationalism, sectionalism. No chance. Okay. Remember, when you get your DBQ on the 15th, it is going to be something that is broad. I'm not saying it's going to cover all of American history, but remember, it's going to talk about, it's going to be like a causation, right? Or a comparison, right? Continuity and change over time. You're not going to get stuck on one little thing, but it's okay. Why are we doing this? To practice working with documents. The juice is definitely going to be worth the squeeze. So the question asks you how nationalism and sectionalism increased during the era of good feelings. That's a fact, right? It's not asking you, did they? Make sure you read these questions carefully, right? So there's a statement, both of these increased, right? And it's asking you a 2-part question, and it's really tough because it's like two DBQs in one, okay? How did both of these beliefs develop concurrently? And did one become of greater importance in the economics and politics of this period, right? The good thing about the documents is 2 of them are grouped together really well, and you can always combine documents. Right? I mean, when we're talking about combined documents, we're talking about when we're making an argument in a paragraph, you can bring a couple of documents together. So as we talk about nationalism developing, okay, remember, when we talk about contextualization, right, let's start off with this, right? And this is why you have to study. There's no shortcut to studying. So right away, you have to know what the era of good feelings is, okay? Whose presidency is that? That's right, President Monroe's, right? And it is nicknamed that because it brings about the existence of how many parties? 1. What brings this about? Okay, contextualization. This is the War of 1812. This is the second generation taking over. And I know Monroe is still part of the Virginia dynasty. I know Monroe is the last of the Revolutionary era who was president of the United States. But when we talk about politics being dominated in this era, this is a new generation, right? This is, think of like President Kennedy, right, is inaugural. The torch has been passed to a new generation, right? Well, this new generation, remember those war hawks that pushed for war, like from Kentucky, Henry Clay, from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, right? Now we start to see this younger group dominate politics with a sense of limitless optimism. It's not about dealing with Europe and the trying to emulate or even be concerned about anything that's going on in Europe. This is where America is emerging separately. And you look at the role that the War of 1812 played, because back to contextualization, yes, the Treaty of Ghent is status quo antebellum, but nobody cares. Remember when we read Donald Hickey's book, right? The War of 1812 matters because of the myth of victory. Perception is reality, and we saw it as a win. We locked horns with Rule Britannia, and we didn't lose, right? We had defeated them on the Great Lakes, right? Oliver Hazard Perry. I've met the enemy in the ARRs, right? The USS Constitution sinks the HMS Guerriere and some other ships as well. And though we got our teeth smashed in with 3 failed invasions of Canada, we got our capital burned down. The rocket spread glare, guys. We stopped them at Fort McHenry. And of course, the route of routes of routes, right? Where General Packingham, the guy that had defeated Napoleon, gets wiped out in trying to take the Mississippi down at the Battle of New Orleans. Was it 2,000 and some British casualties to a handful, 71, something like that. So it's a perception of victory, right? And this nationalism is really seen in American politics. And I would even, suggest right off the bat, outside piece of evidence, right? Talk about, one party role, right? And the Federalists basically don't exist. And Monroe wins overwhelmingly in 1816. And in 1924, his Federalist opponent got one vote, right? And so there's a great piece of that perception. And as we look at these first two documents, they really reflect that attitude of younger Americans that's coming to dominate national policy. Stephen Decatur, I mean, bully for you, if you remember, Stephen Decatur is the guy that in 1815, President Madison sent to the Barbary Coast to finally impose America's will on the Barbary states and have them stop either exacting tribute or ransoming American sailors. But here he is, but our country, right or wrong, right? And it just shows a new outspoken nationalism, and because before we talked about, in the context of the revolution, people talking about liberty, right? And how America was protecting liberty. But now we start to see this new pride in country that is being extolled by a military officer, or here, a poet, right? I know it's not in this document, but America is going to come up with its own form of literature. It's going to be different than just the copied European books. I know Mrs. Booth, Mark Twain is the first American author, but you're starting to see, remember we talked about, James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, and they're writing about things that are American. And here is this patriotic poem. You start to see art become more patriotic. The founding fathers are held with a sense of reverence in all art that is put out during this time period. So these first two documents do a nice job of really reflecting that during this time after the War of 1812, the new generation of Americans dominating the scene, nationalism being way on the rise, right? And I'm going to be honest with you guys, document 3 is the hardest document I've ever looked at. Emma Hart Willard, we had a dorm named after her at Mary Washington. That's about all I remember. No, seriously. This is hard because it's really tough, and that she is extolling the same virtue of nationalism and using it to challenge the fact that Abigail Adams' request for government, quote, remember the ladies, was not being met, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you could use this. To be honest with you, if I'm writing this the old school way, where you're using 6 out of 7 documents, I'm not using this one. It's really tough. But it just shows that, if I had to use it, I'm using it to say, like, look, as she talks about, like, we're not afraid to do things that other nations haven't tried. It's kind of like this total break from Europe, right? And Europe, again, the Stanford woman will teach you all about this next year. It's Western civilization is where we saw this patriarchal society emerge. And she's challenging that. So it's like, hey, stuff's new in America. And certainly you can contextualize in the end that, 29 years later, women are going to demand the right to vote. Now for the easy stuff, right? You look at document number 4 and you look at document number 7, okay? Document 7 is the congressional vote on the tariff of 1816. Document 4 is Henry Clay begging for the next tariff, the tariff of 1824, to be passed. Fact, there's economic nationalism after the War of 1812, and it's out of necessity. Remember, the economy collapses during the War of 1812, right? So what is part of this economic nationalism? Charter another bank, right? That's something that you could use. And you also have internal improvements. That's another part of the American system. However, with both of those, right, bringing in some outside stuff now, because you got to bring in 2 pieces of outside evidence. The national bank gets passed with no problems, but remember, you start to see sectional division over the bank with what? Panic of 1819. What region of the country blames the bank for the Panic of 1819? That's right, the West. What's the long-term impact of that? Yeah, Jacksonian politics. Internal improvements, right? Both Presidents Madison, and then again, we're talking about the era of good feelings, President Monroe, did not succumb to internal improvements, right? That was something that was left up to the states, even though Henry Clay was an advocate and of national finance, national subsidization of internal improvements. It's building that transportation infrastructure. But you know, here, the Erie Canal, who builds that? DeWitt Clinton in New York. So that that nationalism does not translate to internal improvements, and the economic nationalism that passed the bank is eventually going to sow the seed of sectionalism, where the West felt that it was hurt by the bank's actions in 1819, curtailing credit to try to alleviate inflation. When you talk about tariffs, in 1816, remember, this is a protective tariff. It's, yeah, revenue is one thing, but it's also specifically designed to protect American industry. And you can see, where was there the most manufacturing in 1816? That's right, the middle states. They have the most resounding vote for it. There's not as much manufacturing yet in New England, and there's very limited manufacturing in the South. What is it, 15%? In the South votes against it. But like, this is not like the South is going to vote for the tariff in 1824 or 1828, where the South becomes united against the tariff. In 1828, they call it the Tariff of Abominations. Who becomes the leading speaker against the Tariff of Abominations? That's right, John C. Calhoun, with exposition and protest. Well, looky here. John C. Calhoun votes for this out of a sense of economic nationalism. Now, it's very difficult to get this tariff renewed and actually increased. Where'd we go? In 1824, which is why Henry Clay had such a difficult time getting this passed, and the South did not support this, right? We don't have a vote for it, but by 1824, where was there a heck of a lot more manufacturing compared to 1816? New England, right? Samuel Slater, right? Lowell, the town of Lowell, right? Where now you start to see New England have a lot more manufacturing. So by 1824, now the tariff had become a sectionally divisive, that's not a word, divisive issue. Mr. Jackson won't like me saying that, a divisive issue. And by 1828, the next tariff, the Tariff of Abominations, is going to have such a sectional split, South Carolina threatens to secede. Okay. Now, as we shift to politics, we already brought in the outside piece that Monroe basically is, for all intents and purposes, unanimously reelected in 1820. All right, slavery rears its ugly head, and fortunately for you, you have two documents that basically say the exact same thing. John Quincy Adams, who, you know, if you wanted to get an A++ on this, you know, it's remarkable. After his presidency, he's the only president to, after losing in 1828, he's elected to the House of Representatives the next term and becomes the leading voice of abolition in the United States Congress. And he even defends the slaves that freed themselves on the Amistad. So he really distinguishes himself as a future abolitionist. Here we see he's not happy, right? He's favored this Missouri Compromise, but wishes that slavery would have been banned in the Constitution. So as we talk about that and talk about Thomas Jefferson here, that's the famous, I mean, we've talked about this so much, right? The fire bell in the night, where he's talking to this guy, Congressman John Holmes, and he says, you know, I don't really follow the news, but this one I followed, right? And remember, a knell is something you ring at a funeral. And that idea that it is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. And then the famous part, a geographical line, sorry, I'm reading, coinciding with marked principles, moral and political, once conceived and held to the angry passions of men, blah, 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 never be obliterated in each new irritational market deeper and deeper. Jefferson says that it's going to get worse. And we talked about this in the review, because this is the first time there's a national debate on slavery. And it shows that if we're having a debate on slavery, a very tiny portion of it comes out of morality. And certainly that morality would be with John Quincy Adams. But someone like Jefferson, you're not going to, not not too many people more immoral on the idea of slavery. Remember, this is wolf by the ears guy, necessary evil. But here's Jefferson caring not about the morality of it, but rather he sees now two distinct interests emerging in the North and the South. And you know, back to our review, things like the tariff, things like internal improvements, as the North wanted to see the country linked together with this national infrastructure and wanting to have, you know, a strong national bank, and worried about the South, which, although their economy becomes inextricably linked to the North, seeing that they may have a different interest. Obviously, as you're working with those documents and you want to provide all of the context for the Missouri Compromise, you don't need me to review that again. Missouri applies to be a state. Representative Talmadge from New York inserts an amendment for all intents and purposes, making Missouri a free state. The South won't budge. There's gridlock for over a year, right? And then Maine and Missouri, one free, one slave, Thomas Proviso, no slavery above 3630. So, you know, again, there are a million different ways to make the argument about whether nationalism or sectionalism, triumphs. And you know, while the South is put on the defensive, they agreed to federal restrictions on slavery for the first time north of 3630 in the Louisiana Purchase. Very good. You know, there's a lot of different ways that you could do a conclusion with this afterwards. Whether you want to go into the immediate future and say, hey, look, man, this era of national harmony is divided in 1824, where with one political party, we had sectional candidates. Crawford in the South, Clay in the West, Quincy Adams in the Northeast, and Jackson having some national appeal. And then certainly talk about how, you know, during the age of Jackson coming up next, the country is torn apart over the bank, torn apart over the tariff, right? And then even though compromise is reached with Missouri in 1820, well, what happens when we sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1846? Getting the Mexican cession, we got half of Mexico, right? And you're going to have an even bigger problem when you have to sign the Compromise of 1850. It's even harder to get the Compromise of 1850 than the Missouri Compromise. And while the Missouri Compromise lasted for 30 years, the Compromise of 1850 lasts for 10. So hopefully that helped you out a little bit with this. Again, if you do this and you send it to me and you put in a lot of work, I'll put in a lot of work on it. You know, that's up to you. It's not required, but I hope that helped you out a little bit. Okay.